Welcome back to Whispers in the Shadows, the channel where we dive deep into the darkest corners of human nature. Before we begin today's story, a tale of passion, betrayal, and a secret buried deep within the countryside, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. You won't want to miss the chilling stories we have in store. Now, settle in as we journey to the seemingly peaceful village of Oakhaven, where a family's darkest secrets are about to be exposed. The Blackwood estate, known as the Willows, was the jewel of Oakhaven. It was a sprawling Georgian manor, its pale stone walls draped in ivy that turned a fiery crimson in the autumn. For generations, the Blackwood family had been the closest thing to aristocracy the quiet countryside had known. Arthur Blackwood, the current patriarch, was a man whose posture seemed as rigid as his principles, a former barrister who now managed the family's considerable investments with a quiet, stern authority. His wife, Eleanor, was the epitome of country grace, her life dedicated to charity committees, garden parties, and maintaining the flawless facade of their perfect life. Their son, Julian, was the heir apparent, handsome and charming, but with a restless energy that the tranquil pace of Oakhaven could never quite contain. He had returned to the Willows a few years prior, after a moderately successful but ultimately unfulfilling stint as a gallery owner in London. He brought with him his wife, Clara, a woman whose city-bred sensibilities were a stark contrast to the entrenched traditions of the Blackwood family. Clara was beautiful, intelligent, and vibrant, but in the hushed, opulent halls of the Willows, she felt like a caged bird, her colorful plumage dulled by the oppressive quiet. The fifth member of this strained tableau was Arthur's much younger brother, Thomas. Where Arthur was rigid and predictable, Thomas was a man of quiet passions. A reclusive writer, he occupied a renovated stable house on the edge of the estate, his days spent crafting historical novels that earned him modest acclaim. He was a gentle, observant soul, and his infrequent appearances at the main house were often a source of quiet relief for Clara, who found in him a kindred spirit, another soul who didn't quite fit the Blackwood mold. The illicit affair did not begin with a crash of thunder, but with a series of quiet, stolen moments. It started with shared glances across the long mahogany dining table, a silent acknowledgement of a particularly dry remark from Arthur. It grew in the library, where Julian would be engrossed in his business ledgers, oblivious to the way Thomas's hand brushed against Clara's as they both reached for the same volume of poetry. Clara was suffocating. Julian, once the charming escape from her city life, had become a hollow echo of his father. His days were consumed with proving his worth to Arthur, his nights with the quiet desperation of a man who fears he is failing. He and Clara moved in separate orbits within the same house, their conversations reduced to pleasantries and logistics. The passion that had once defined them had withered under the constant, scrutinizing gaze of Blackwood tradition. Thomas, in his solitude, saw her loneliness because it mirrored his own. He saw the flicker of life in her eyes dim with each passing month. He started leaving freshly cut flowers from his garden on her windowsill. He'd recommend books, leaving them on the patio for her, knowing she sought refuge there. These small gestures were lifelines thrown across a chasm of polite indifference. Their first real conversation, away from the prying eyes of the main house, happened by the lake at the edge of the property. Julian was away on a business trip. Arthur and Eleanor were attending a county dinner. The house was, for the first time in a long time, quiet. "You look like you're 1,000 miles away," Thomas said, his voice soft, not wanting to startle her as she stared across the water. Clara turned, a sad smile gracing her lips. "Only 1,000? I was aiming for at least 3. He chuckled, a warm, genuine sound that was rare in her life now. He sat on the bench beside her, leaving a respectful distance. "London. Sometimes," she admitted, her gaze drifting back to the water. "Sometimes, just somewhere else. A place where the silence isn't so loud." Thomas understood that sentiment perfectly. "The silence here has weight," he agreed. "It's filled with unspoken expectations." That one sentence, that simple validation of her feelings, broke something open in Clara. For the first time since arriving at the Willows, she felt seen. They talked for hours as the sun bled across the sky, painting the lake in hues of orange and purple. She spoke of her dreams of opening a small bookstore, of her love for art, of the woman she was before she became Mrs. Julian Blackwood. He spoke of his characters, of the worlds he built to escape this one, of his own quiet frustrations with the Blackwood legacy. The affair was not a conscious decision, but an inevitable slide. A hand held a moment too long. A shared walk in the woods that ended with a lingering, desperate kiss in the rain-soaked shelter of an ancient oak tree. Secret meetings in his stable house, a sanctuary of worn leather chairs and the comforting smell of old books, became their only reality. There, they were not Julian's wife and Arthur's brother. They were simply Thomas and Clara, two lonely people finding solace in each other's arms. The risk was immense, a fire they were kindling in a house built of tinder. But the danger was part of the allure. The deception was a language only they spoke, a secret world they had built for themselves within the gilded cage of the Willows. And as the summer reached its peak, their passion burned hotter, more reckless, oblivious to the storm that was gathering just over the horizon. The quiet countryside was holding its breath, waiting for the scandal to break. The annual Blackwood Summer Gala was the social event of the season in Oakhaven. It was Eleanor's magnum opus, a meticulously planned affair where the local gentry mingled with business associates from the city, all under the pretense of charity. For Clara, it was the pinnacle of her performance as the perfect Blackwood wife. It was a night of tight smiles, polite laughter, and a suffocating designer gown that felt more like a costume than clothing. This year, the tension was a palpable, living entity. Julian, stressed and drinking more than usual, was either brusque and dismissive or cloyingly attentive, a public display of affection that felt like a brand on her skin. He cornered her by the French doors leading to the terrace, his voice a low hiss beneath the string quartet's melody. "You seem distant tonight, Clara. Are you enjoying yourself?" The question was an accusation. "It's a wonderful party, Julian. Your mother has outdone herself," she replied, her voice a carefully modulated, pleasant hum. "That's not what I asked." He gripped her arm, his fingers digging into the delicate silk. "I see you watching him." The hymn was left unsaid but hung in the air between them. Thomas was keeping his distance, nursing a single glass of whiskey near the grand fireplace, his eyes occasionally finding hers across the crowded room. The connection was a physical jolt, a silent conversation that Julian was beginning to decipher. "I don't know what you're talking about," Clara said, pulling her arm away. "Don't you?" His eyes, so like his father's, were cold and hard. "This family has a reputation, Clara. I suggest you remember that." He turned and walked away, leaving her with a racing heart and a chilling premonition of disaster. Later, under the guise of getting some air, she found Thomas on the far side of the sprawling lawn, near the rose garden. The music from the party was a faint murmur, and the air was thick with the scent of blooming night jasmine. "He knows," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Or he suspects. He's watching us." Thomas took her hand, his warmth a stark contrast to Julian's icy grip. "Let him suspect, Clara. What can he do? We've been discreet." "You don't know him," she insisted, a frantic edge to her tone. "He's not just angry. He's possessive. This house, his name, me. We're his property. He'll never let me go." The desperation in her voice moved Thomas to do something reckless. "Then leave him," he said, his voice firm. "Come with me. We can go away, start somewhere new. I have my own money. We don't need the Blackwoods." The proposition was a terrifying, beautiful fantasy. For a moment, Clara allowed herself to imagine it. A small apartment, a bookstore, a life where she could breathe. But the reality of her situation crashed down on her. Julian's threats, Arthur's influence, the public humiliation, it was an insurmountable wall. Before she could answer, they heard footsteps on the gravel path. Julian emerged from the shadows, his face a mask of controlled fury. His eyes flickered from Thomas's hand holding Clara's, up to their stricken faces. "A beautiful night for a stroll, isn't it?" Uncle? Julian's voice was dangerously calm. I see you're enjoying my wife's company. Julian, this isn't what it looks like, Thomas began, stepping in front of Clara protectively. Oh, I think it's exactly what it looks like, Julian sneered, taking a step closer. The smell of whiskey was strong on his breath. The reclusive writer and the lonely wife. It's a bloody cliché. Hiding in the shadows, whispering in my garden. Have you been sleeping with her in my house? The question was a slap. That's enough, Julian, Thomas warned, his own voice hardening. Is it? Julian's attention snapped to Clara. Is it enough for you? Is his fumbling poetry better than what your husband can give you? He lunged for Clara, grabbing her arm again. Thomas reacted instantly, shoving Julian back. The move was defensive, meant only to create space, but Julian was drunk and unsteady. He stumbled backward, his heel catching on the low stone border of the rose garden. There was a sickening, sharp crack as the back of his head struck the base of a stone sundial. He crumpled to the ground, his body landing awkwardly among the prize-winning crimson roses. For a moment, there was only silence, broken by the distant laughter from the party. Clara stared, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. Thomas rushed to Julian's side, his face pale in the moonlight. Julian, he said, his voice a choked whisper. He gently turned him over. A dark, viscous pool was already beginning to form beneath Julian's head, staining the pristine white petals of a rose a deeper, more terrible shade of red. His eyes were open, staring blankly up at the star-filled sky. There was no breath, no sign of life. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The string quartet played on, a surreal soundtrack to the horror that had just unfolded. Julian Blackwood, the heir to the family fortune, lay dead in his mother's rose garden. And the two people who were the cause of it stood frozen, their illicit secret now bound forever by the specter of death. Panic, cold and absolute, began to set in. The secret affair was over. A new, far more terrifying secret had just begun. The seconds after Julian's fall stretched into an eternity. The distant, cheerful sound of the party, the clinking of glasses and bursts of laughter, was a grotesque counterpoint to the silent horror in the rose garden. Clara's mind was a maelstrom of white noise, the only clear thought being a single looping word. No, 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 no. It was Thomas who moved first, his writer's mind, accustomed to navigating crises on the page, kicking into a desperate, pragmatic gear. He pressed his fingers to Julian's neck, a futile search for a pulse he knew he wouldn't find. The unnatural stillness of the body confirmed the worst. He's gone, Thomas stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. It was a statement of fact, a foundation upon which the coming nightmare would be built. Clara finally broke, a choked sob escaping her lips. She sank to her knees, her silk dress pooling in the damp earth, inches from the spreading blood. What have we done? Oh God, what have we done? I did it, Thomas corrected her, his gaze sharp, focused. I pushed him. You need to remember that. I pushed him, and he fell. It was an accident, she whispered, rocking back and forth. We have to call the police. An ambulance. And tell them what? Thomas's voice was a harsh whisper. He grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. Tell them that his wife and his uncle were having an affair? That we were caught? That we had a fight and he's now dead? Who do you think they'll believe, Clara? They will see a jealous husband, a cheating wife, and a lover with a motive. They will tear us apart. He was right. The image was damning. The scandal would be the only thing anyone saw. The quiet, resentful writer and the beautiful, unhappy wife. It was a story that wrote itself, and it ended with them in prison. Arthur Blackwood's influence would ensure it. He would see their actions not as a tragic accident, but as the ultimate betrayal, and he would use every ounce of his power to see them punished. So what do we do? Clara's voice was barely audible, the words lost in the fragrant night air. Thomas looked around the garden, his eyes darting from the darkened woods beyond the lawn to the brightly lit windows of the main house. The party was still in full swing. No one had seen them, No one had heard anything over the music. They had a window, a small, terrifying sliver of time. "We make him disappear," Thomas said, the words tasting like poison. Clara stared at him, horrified. "Disappear? Thomas, what are you saying? We can't just hide a body. We have to," he insisted, his grip on her shoulders tightening. "Think, Clara. If he's found here, our lives are over. But if he simply leaves? If he storms away from the party, drunk and angry? People saw him drinking. They saw him arguing with you. It's plausible. It gives us time." The logic was twisted, born of pure terror, but it was a plan. It was a path, and right now, any path was better than the immediate, certain ruin of calling the police. A cold resolve began to settle over Clara, pushing the panic down, encasing her heart in ice. "Where?" she asked, her voice now steady. "Where could we possibly?" Thomas's eyes drifted toward the woods at the far end of the estate. Deep within them was an old, abandoned well, a relic from a time before the house had modern plumbing. It was stone-lined, deep, and hadn't been used in over a century. It was covered by a heavy stone slab, overgrown with moss and forgotten by everyone. Everyone except Thomas, who had stumbled upon it during one of his long, solitary walks. "The old well," he said. "In the North Woods." The plan was insane, a ghoulish plot ripped from the pages of one of his own novels. But it was their only chance. The first step was the most harrowing. They had to move him. Using a thick, canvas ground sheet Thomas fetched from the potting shed, they rolled Julian's body onto it. The weight of him, the dead, inert weight of the man she had once loved, was a physical and psychic burden that would haunt Clara forever. His limbs were still pliant, and the act felt like a grotesque violation. They dragged him, a terrible, silent procession of two, across the manicured lawn, staying in the deep shadows cast by the ancient oak trees. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sounded like a gunshot in the night. They reached the edge of the woods, a dark, menacing wall of trees that seemed to swallow the moonlight. "We need to get the car," Thomas breathed, his body slick with sweat. "It's too far to carry him. My car is parked behind the stable house. No one will see me take it." "What about the blood?" Clara gestured back toward the rose garden. The crimson bloom on the petals, a nightmarish afterimage, burned into her mind. "One thing at a time," Thomas said, his voice strained. "We deal with him first. Then we clean up." He left her there, a lone, terrified guardian of their awful secret, while he went to fetch his car. Clara stood in the oppressive darkness of the woods, the wrapped body of her husband at her feet. The music of the party drifted through the trees, a mocking reminder of the world they had just left behind, a world they could never return to. She was no longer just an unfaithful wife. She was something much, much darker. And as she waited, listening to the frantic beating of her own heart, she knew that the silence of Oakhaven would never feel peaceful again. It would forever be the sound of a secret being kept. The journey through the woods was a descent into hell. Thomas maneuvered his old Land Rover down a barely there service track, the headlights cutting a frantic, bouncing path through the dense undergrowth. The wrapped body of Julian was in the back, and with every bump and jolt, a soft, sickening thud reminded them of their cargo. Clara sat in the passenger seat, rigid, her knuckles white as she gripped the dashboard. She didn't speak. There were no words for this. They finally reached the small clearing where the old well was hidden. It looked even more sinister in the dark, a low, circular stone wall choked with weeds and ivy. The heavy stone slab that covered it was a tombstone for a forgotten time. "Help me with the cover," Thomas grunted, his voice strained. It took their combined strength, their muscles screaming in protest, to slide the massive slab aside. It moved with a grinding, scraping sound that seemed to echo through the silent woods. A wave of cool, musty air, smelling of damp earth and decay, rose from the blackness below. It was a gaping, circular mouth leading to the bowels of the earth. Lifting Julian's body from the back of the car was the final, terrible act. He was heavy, an awkward, uncooperative weight. As they maneuvered him to the edge of the well, the canvas sheet slipped, and his face was momentarily exposed in the moonlight. His eyes were still open, his expression one of slack-jawed surprise. Clara let out a strangled cry and turned away, bile rising in her throat. "Now, Clara," Thomas urged, his voice cracking under the strain. Together they pushed. The body toppled over the edge and fell into the blackness. There was no scream, only the sound of rushing air, a few seconds of terrifying silence, and then a deep, hollow splash as it hit the water far below. The sound was horribly final. They stood, panting, their bodies trembling with adrenaline and exertion, listening to the echoes fade. They slid the stone slab back into place. The scraping noise was the sound of a door being sealed forever. Their secret was buried. The drive back was silent. The first part of their nightmare was over, but the second was just beginning. They parked the car back behind the stable house and crept back towards the main house like ghosts. The party was winding down. Guests were beginning to leave, their cheerful goodbyes drifting on the night air. Their most critical task remained: the rose garden. Armed with buckets, cloths, and a powerful garden hose, they worked under the cover of darkness. Thomas used the hose to dilute and wash away the blood, directing the runoff into the dense soil beneath the rose bushes. It felt like an eternity, every drop of water a prayer for erasure. Clara, on her hands and knees, used a cloth to wipe down the base of the sundial, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold on. She scrubbed at the stone, trying to scour away the sin that had stained it. She then took a pair of shears and carefully pruned the blood-spattered roses, her movements jerky and frantic. She would burn them later, along with the soiled cloths and the canvas sheet. No trace could remain. As the first hint of dawn threatened the eastern sky, they were finished. The garden looked pristine, washed clean by the night. To a casual observer, nothing was amiss, but they could still see it. They could see the ghost of the stain on the stone, the phantom crimson on the newly budded roses. Clara slipped back into the main house, her heart pounding with every creak of the floorboards. She made it to her bedroom, stripped off her ruined dress, and stood under a scalding shower, scrubbing her skin as if she could wash away the memory of what she had done. The next morning, the performance began. Eleanor noted Julian's absence with a frown. Clara, her face a pale, strained mask, offered the story they had concocted. "He was very drunk," she said, her voice a believable imitation of a weary, concerned wife. "We had an argument. He said he was going for a drive to clear his head. I thought he would have come back by now." The lie was planted. Arthur was dismissive. "Foolish boy. He's probably slept it off in some cheap hotel. He'll be back when he's sobered up and needs money." But as the day wore on, and Julian didn't return, a seed of unease began to sprout. By evening, Eleanor was frantic. By the next day, against Arthur's proud and stubborn wishes, she called the police. The investigation began quietly. 2 local officers came to the Willows, their presence an alien intrusion into the perfect, ordered world of the Blackwoods. Clara repeated her story, her voice steady, her eyes downcast. She was the picture of a worried, slightly estranged wife. Thomas, when questioned, claimed to have left the party early, suffering from a headache. He saw nothing. He heard nothing. They were 2 separate islands of deception, their alibis simple and, they hoped, unshakable. Days turned into a week. Julian's car was found abandoned in a car park at a train station 2 towns over. The police theory began to solidify. The wealthy heir, unhappy with his life, had simply walked away. Perhaps he had taken a train to the city to escape his responsibilities. It was a plausible narrative. But the secret festered between Clara and Thomas. They avoided each other, the shared guilt a chasm between them. The stolen moments of passion were replaced by a shared, silent terror. Sleep offered no escape for Clara. She was haunted by dreams of the well, of Julian's open eyes staring up at her from the black water. The quiet countryside was no longer a cage. It was a tomb, and she and Thomas were its unwilling keepers, bound together not by love, but by the weight of the unquiet grave they had created. The initial belief that Julian had simply left began to fray as weeks turned into months. A man like Julian Blackwood, for all his frustrations, was a creature of comfort and habit. He wasn't resourceful enough to disappear without a trace. His bank accounts remained untouched, his credit cards unused. The police investigation, once a quiet formality, slowly began to intensify, the official theory shifting from a voluntary disappearance to suspected foul play. The Willows transformed from a gilded cage into a pressure cooker. The weight of the unspoken secret poisoned every interaction. Arthur, his authority challenged by this inexplicable event, became even more tyrannical, his grief manifesting as rage. He treated Clara with open contempt, seeing her as the catalyst for his son's disappearance. Eleanor, meanwhile, withered. Her perfect world had been shattered, and she drifted through the grand rooms like a ghost, her days a blur of quiet weeping and anxious phone calls to the police inspector. For Clara, the psychological toll was devastating. Every creak of the floorboards at night sounded like Julian's footsteps. The scent of roses made her physically ill. The lie was a constant, exhausting performance. She became gaunt, her eyes ringed with dark circles, her vibrant spirit completely extinguished. She was trapped, a prisoner of the crime, chained to the very family she had longed to escape. Her relationship with Thomas was the greatest casualty. The passion they had shared was dead, replaced by a shared terror that was isolating rather than bonding. They couldn't speak of what happened, not even to each other. A single misplaced word could bring everything crashing down. When their eyes met, they saw not a lover, but an accomplice, a reflection of their own guilt. The stable house, once their sanctuary, became a place Thomas could no longer bear, its walls echoing with the memory of their catastrophic choices. The break came from an unexpected quarter. A particularly dry autumn gave way to a winter of torrential rains. The water table in the region rose to unprecedented levels. The old, forgotten well, which had held its secret in the dark water for months, began to overflow. A local farmer, checking the fences on a piece of land bordering the Blackwood estate, noticed a strange overflow from an area of the woods he'd always ignored. Investigating, he found the mossy stone well, water bubbling up from the cracks around the sealed lid, carrying with it a horrific, unmistakable smell of decomposition. The discovery of the body sent a shockwave through Oakhaven. The quiet countryside was now the center of a grim and sensational murder investigation. The identification was swift. The remains found in the well were those of Julian Blackwood. The autopsy revealed the cause of death: blunt force trauma to the back of the head. The police descended on the Willows, and this time, they were not making polite inquiries. The house was a crime scene. Under the relentless, methodical questioning of seasoned detectives, Clara's carefully constructed composure crumbled. The months of guilt, fear, and psychological torment had worn her down to a raw nerve. Presented with the undeniable fact that Julian had never left the property, her story fell apart. She broke down, her confession a torrent of desperate, whispered words, a pathetic attempt to frame it as an accident, a tragic mistake. She tried to protect Thomas, claiming she had pushed Julian alone, but her story was inconsistent, her timeline flawed. When the detectives confronted Thomas with her confession, he knew the game was over. In a quiet, resigned voice, he told them the truth, taking the bulk of the responsibility. He had pushed Julian. He had conceived the plan to hide the body. The scandal was everything they had feared and more. It was a national sensation, the story of the blue-blooded Blackwood family, their perfect facade ripped away to reveal a sordid tale of adultery, betrayal, and murder. The trial was a media circus. Arthur and Eleanor had to endure the daily humiliation of seeing their family's darkest secrets laid bare for the world to see. Arthur's reputation was destroyed, his name forever associated with this monstrous tragedy. In the end, the court accepted that the initial act was not premeditated murder, but manslaughter. However, the subsequent cover-up, the calculated and ghoulish disposal of the body, sealed their fates. Thomas, as the one who delivered the fatal push and orchestrated the plan, received a lengthy prison sentence. Clara, for her role as an accomplice and her part in the concealment, was also sentenced to several years behind bars. The story ends not with a bang, but with the hollow echo of ruin. The Willows, once the symbol of Blackwood prestige, was sold. Arthur and Eleanor retreated from public life, broken and disgraced. Oakhaven, the quiet countryside town, would forever be marked as the place where the perfect family imploded in a storm of illicit passion and dark secrets. The love affair between Clara and Thomas, born in a desire for freedom, had resulted in the ultimate imprisonment, not just behind the steel bars of a jail cell, but within a lifelong cage of guilt and regret, haunted by the memory of a crimson rose and the terrible, final splash in the darkness of the well.